Well, good morning, everybody. It's I'm going to say about 11 o'clock on Sunday, the 4th of May, 2025, and I'm just riding around the town in Launceston. I've got no particular destination in mind. I'm just riding around, uh, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about China, or the People's Republic of China, as it's properly called. So, if you don't want to hear my thoughts and my commentary on that matter, then turn the volume down and just enjoy the scenery. If you have a comment, then you know where to leave it, and I'll respond to it when I become aware of it. I should say at the outset here, I've never been to China. I don't know anybody in China. I have no connections to any companies or businesses that operate in China or buy things from China. I haven't been asked by anybody or paid by anybody to make these comments. They're purely my own opinions, my own thoughts, and my own point of view based on a little bit of research and a bit of thinking about the situation. And so I'm just going to sort of explain how it is that I see that China has become the economic powerhouse that it is, the world's second largest economy, I believe, at the moment, and possibly posing a threat to becoming the world's largest economy. Uh, And as I say, you're welcome to accept or disagree with my thoughts and my opinions. As I said, if you have a comment, then make a comment based on the content of what I've said, uh, rather than what you perceive might be my political affiliations or biases or whatever. Inevitably, when you're talking about economics, you cannot avoid the subject of politics because those two things go hand in hand. But my main focus here is to talk about economics as I understand it. Now, the People's Republic of China, to give it its proper name, came into being in 1949. Prior to that, there was a country called China. It had a variety of names. But in 1949, after the success of the uh, Communist Party in the civil war between themselves and the conservative forces who were called the Kuomintang, and the expulsion of the Japanese who had occupied parts of China since early in the 20th century, the People's Republic of China was established. Its capital was in what was then called Peking, which we now call Beijing, and the leader of China at the time, the leader of the Communist Party, the chairman of the Communist Party, leader of the government, was a man called Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong, as he was often referred to, uh, and he uh, was a very powerful and influential figure in Chinese politics for a long time during the course of the Civil War and afterwards. So much so that uh, he produced a book called The Thoughts of Chairman Mao, a little red book as it was referred to, and many Chinese people carried that book with them and quoted his thoughts frequently. Uh, I guess, like any other country that's establishing itself, the first thing it wants to do is create stability and peace and an end to the war, whatever it was, whoever you're fighting. And then you want to build a society where you can cater to the needs of people, give people a better life. I think in that regard, the Chinese government of any persuasion, be it now or in the past, is probably no different from any government anywhere else in the world. They want to give their people a better life. They want to give them a better standard of living, uh, better jobs, higher paying jobs, better education, health services, and so on and so forth. Um, and so they set about doing that. But our perception of China over that initial period from 1949 onwards was nothing more than a country filled with hundreds of millions of people who were all peasant farmers eking out existence on what were called communes, where they grew crops, various sorts, and did their best to feed themselves. Uh, Now that perception of China lasted for a very long time because governments in the West, that is Australia, Europe, the United States, Canada, countries like that, decided that they would not recognise the People's Republic of China. And what that meant was that they had no diplomatic representation in Beijing, or Peking as it was then. They had no way of making any contact with the Chinese government, and then no far as we were concerned, China was a communist country and communists were bad, and we didn't want anything to do with them. Now that all changed when Richard Nixon, the Republican of his time, surreptitiously made a visit to China with the view to opening up diplomatic relations between the United States and China. I say surreptitiously because the visit was not announced in advance and nobody knew where he was until he got there. He was very warmly welcomed by the Chinese and very politely treated and so on, and not too long afterwards an American embassy was established in China. Nevertheless, there were still politicians in Australia who were insisting that Red China, Communist China, was the devil incarnate and we should have nothing to do with it. However, the newly elected Labor Prime Minister in 1972 or thereabouts, Gough Whitlam, decided to be pragmatic and say there are 850 million or more of these Chinese people not too far away from us. We are being ridiculous by pretending not to recognise and pretending that they're not there and not having any diplomatic relations with them. So he made a visit to China and an Australian embassy was opened in China. And so a market that contained, even at that stage, something like 850 million people became available to Western countries. We could sell stuff to China. At the same time, China was changing from a purely agricultural country to a country that was making things. And in the same way as when the Japanese first started making things, made in Japan was like a death knell or something. They made very poor quality goods that fell apart when you touched them. Nobody minded too much because you didn't pay too much for them in the first place. But made in China had a similar ring to it. It was rubbish and very poor quality and it would fall apart after a short period of time. But just like the Japanese, who eventually realised if we're going to be in this car business, we've got to make good cars. And they did. If we're going to make sound equipment, we've got to make good sound equipment. And now Pioneer, JVC, Sanyo, Sony and so on are the benchmark for what is considered to be good, affordable audio systems, for example. There were lots of other things that the Japanese did very well as well. But one of the things that they did was when Citizen, Seiko and Casio, among others, learned how to make watches using quartz movements, they just about destroyed the Swiss watch industry. So when the Chinese first started making products and exporting them to us, we thought of them as cheap, shoddy goods that would fall apart in no time, but didn't cost very much, so we didn't care. But at some point, and this is where it gets really interesting, at some point, and I don't know exactly when that is, but an economic historian will be able to tell you exactly, but at some point, companies in Europe and the United States and Australia all decided that they would open factories in China to make their products. And so they came to the Chinese government and said, look, we'd like to open a factory to make shoes or underwear or clothing or whatever it is. And the Chinese government thought about this for a while and thought, well, what's in it for us? And the companies all said, well, there's jobs in it for you. We'll open factories here and your people will get jobs and that'll be good for your economy. And so, of course, the Chinese said, well, okay, that's what we want. We want jobs for our people. We want better standard of living. We want work. So they agreed to it. Now, the company that went to China, in a process that became so common that it became known, it had its own name, it was called offshoring. They didn't do it out of any goodness of their heart or any idea that we want to help China to grow as an economy or anything like that. They still thought that Chinese were communists and communists were bad and we didn't want anything to do with them, but they went there because there was a massive, and I mean massive, hundreds of millions, 800, 900 million, maybe a billion people. There was a massive pool of cheap labour. And that meant that whether you were making shoes or you were making clothing or later on washing machines, dishwashers and all those other white goods, you could make those goods incredibly cheaper than you could make them in Australia or Germany or the United States or Britain or anywhere else. And so you could still sell the good for the same price you were selling it before, but now you could make it much cheaper. Profits would still be good, high. Dividends to shareholders would be great. Share price would be good. All of the executives of the company would get their performance bonuses, everyone would be happy. The consumers would be happy because they'd be buying cheap goods, and it didn't matter where they were made. The only people who suffered in all this were the people who worked in the factories in Australia and Europe who were closed down, the factories that were closed down so things could be offshored to China. Now, as I said, the main reason for that was cheap labour costs, but there were other benefits to the companies that went offshore, went to China, and that was that pesky industrial laws that we had in Australia and other European Western nations, in Europe and so forth, they didn't apply. Or if they did, we didn't have to worry about them because they were Chinese law, not our law. Same thing applied with workplace health and safety, and the same thing applied with environmental laws. If there were any in those countries, and we assumed they weren't, but if there were, then they were Chinese laws and not our problem. We would abide by them. We, that is, the companies who made this stuff over there, would abide by these laws, but we'd say, well, they're Chinese laws, so they're not things we have any influence over. We just have to obey the law there. And we'll appoint somebody, a Chinese person, to manage our company and our business over there. And if something goes wrong, well, they'll get fired, and we'll just appoint someone else. We'll pay a fine if that's the case, and we'll carry on business as usual. Now, that all might sound a bit cynical, but that's pretty well what happened. So suddenly there are factories opening all over China making Nike and Adidas and all the other sports shoes, and making ordinary shoes as well, and making clothing. And, before long, they're making white goods, wash machines, dishwashers, air conditioners, all that sort of stuff. And then, before much longer, they're making computers, tablets, smartwatches, and all that sort of stuff as well. And although you look at your product in an iPad and says designed in Cupertino or Cupertino, however you say that word, it's actually assembled in China. And in the same way as the Japanese set about learning how to make good cars and learning how to make good sound equipment, and I forgot to mention at the time, once they learned how to make good motorcycles, they destroyed the British motorcycle industry by just making better motorcycles that were more affordable, more reliable, and just plain better motorcycles. The Chinese at some point decided that they would no longer just be the place that made cheap goods for foreign companies. They thought, well, why don't we make stuff for ourselves? And they started making, why don't we have companies that make stuff that belong to us? And so the profits from those factories and their work stay in China. Now, China had always made automobiles, but they never sold them outside of China. And to be honest, they probably weren't very good either. And then the Chinese didn't have much to compare with because they didn't import foreign vehicles; they just built their own. So they didn't know that their vehicles weren't that good. But at some point, and I don't know when this was, but at some point, whether it was current leader Xi Jinping or somebody before him, they decided that they would do two things. They would do them well. One is that they would learn to make motor cars. They would learn to make motor cars that were good quality, affordable cars. Now, the question of whether you want to buy a Chinese car is separate from whether the cars are affordable and good quality. You might say, I don't want a Chinese car, but then you might have also said, I don't want a Japanese car. And the second thing they decided was that they would become a leader in the manufacture of electric vehicles. Now, again, you might make the argument and say, well, I don't want an EV, so I don't care if they're good at that or not. I suspect there were lots of reasons why the Chinese decided they would specialise in making electric vehicles, although they do make combustion vehicles and plug-in hybrids as well. They are the specialist nation for the making of electric vehicles. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But I suspect there are a couple of reasons. One is they probably wanted to reduce their dependence on foreign oil, just like they say Australia ought to do. To my knowledge, China has no oil reserves, and so all their oil is imported. And they thought at some stage, if ever we get involved in a conflict with Western nations, our oil supplies could be cut off, and our country could come to a standstill, and we're not going to have that. So we're going to make vehicles that don't need oil. They also came to the conclusion that they have lots of what are referred to as rare earths, and they are the minerals that are needed to make the batteries for electric vehicles, to make a lot of the other components for electric vehicles. They have lots of it. And they thought, well, if we've got this stuff, why don't we make use of it instead of selling it to someone else? And if we sell it to them, we'll still control the export of it, but we'll have enough of it to do what we need to do, which is make the parts for our vehicles. And a third thing that they did, whether they, I think it must have been conscious decisions to say we're going to control the supply chain as well. We're going to do what's called vertical integration, which means that every aspect or as many aspects of the production of the vehicle, in this case I'm referring specifically to electric vehicles, as much of the production of that electric vehicle is going to take place either in our factory or in a company that we control. So the batteries, the motors, the body parts, all the electrical componentry and so on are going to be made in places that we have control of, so that we don't have to suffer supply chain interruptions. We don't have problems when some country decides to impose a tariff on us or some other export burden, so we can't get the materials that we need to make the product that we want to make when we want to make it. So we'll have this, what's called vertical integration. And I'm not spruiking any particular brands or models or anything like that, but it's clear that, for example, BYD have done exactly that. Most of the componentry for the BYD cars is made in factories that BYD owns or manage in China, be it the batteries, the engines, the body parts, the seats, and so forth. So the Chinese simply decided we are not going to be a country that's known for just making cheap, shoddy goods that fall apart after 5 minutes. We're going to make good quality goods. We're going to make goods at an affordable price, and they'll be affordable because our labour is much cheaper. And we're going to make them, companies that make them are going to be Chinese companies. So we're going to get the benefits, and the profits from those manufacture of those goods is going to stay in China and benefit our people rather than go offshore to benefit Apple or Garmin or any other company you want to name that builds their product in China but is based somewhere else. Now, our role in this was very simple. Our role, the role of Western nations, not our role as Australia, although we played a part in the course, because we sent our factories and our manufacturing was all offshored for the reasons that I've outlined. But our role in this was very simple. We opened the factories there in China first of all, so we encouraged the production of whatever it was we wanted to make in China, but we also were very generous in selling them raw materials. Australia, for example, we sell huge amounts of iron ore to China. We sell huge amounts of coal to China. And although China is a country that's working hard to replace coal-fired power stations with renewable energy, they still use a lot of Australian coal. Even if they don't use it for renewable energy, they use it for making steel. So we've been very kind in selling them our raw materials and resources so they could make the things that they wanted to make. And then we were also very generous and very thoughtful and very kind in saying, well, we'll buy the stuff that you make, because we don't make it here in Australia anymore, but we want it. We don't make washing machines, dryers, dishwashers, televisions, tablets, smartwatches, phones. We don't make clothing. We don't make shoes. You name it, we don't make it, but we want to buy it, and we want to buy it cheaply. So if you make it, we'll give you the raw materials to make it. But not only that, we'll buy it from you when you've made it. And so doing so, and not just Australia, but all the nations in the West, the American, United States market, the Canadian market, the British market, the European market, all the same thing. We want tablets, computers, televisions, dishwashers, all that sort of stuff, and we want it as cheaply as possible. So we're prepared to buy it from China, and they're rubbing their hands and saying, well, thanks very much. We're making this stuff, you're buying it, our companies are getting rich, our economy is growing, we're lifting people out of poverty, which is what we want to do, we're providing them with a better standard of living, which is what we want to do, and in theory, everybody's happy. Now, I said I didn't want to talk too much about politics, but politics and economics are intertwined, so I can't ignore the subject. In the Western world, as again Europe, Australia, United Kingdom, United States and so on, We, the people, every 3, 4, or 5 years, depending on which country you live in, we get to go to the polls and we get to vote for people that we want to run our government for the next 3, 4, or 5 years. We've just done that in Australia yesterday, and we've decided we want to stick with the people that we know for whatever reasons. Um, and so we've given the incumbent government another 3 years. Now we all think that's a good idea because it means that we all get to have a say in who is in government and a say in how the country is run and how the economy is run and so on. And we would condemn other countries like China where either they don't have elections or the results of the elections are predetermined because there's either only one candidate or it's a bit of a I'm not sure what I'm trying to think of the word here, but the exercise of going to vote isn't really, there's no real choice. There's only one candidate, and that is the party candidate. So you get to vote for somebody, but the outcome is already predetermined. We'd say that what happens every time is undemocratic and wrong. And I'll come to that, explain that a little bit more in a moment. Now, this choosing the government every 3, 4, or 5 years thing in Australia is a good thing in many ways, because we do get to have a say in who runs the country. If we think that one mob that are running the country aren't doing a good job, we can just get rid of them and say, well, we'll get some other people in. If we think they're doing a good job, as we clearly do, we can say, well, all right, you can have another 3 years to do things. But we get to say that. We get to decide who gets to represent us at a national level, but also who gets to represent us at a local level. In our electorate, we get to choose somebody. And if we decide that the person who has been representing us has been doing a good job, we give them another turn at it. If we decide they've not been doing a good job, we get rid of them and get somebody else in. And that's a good thing. But there is a downside to that, and the downside to that is that our governments of all persuasions have very short memories, and they're only really ever interested in the electoral cycle, which, as I said, is 3 or 4 years in Australia. 3 years at the federal level and 4 years at most state levels now. And so the government of the day is thinking only about, well, what do I have to do? What do we have to do to get re-elected? What do we have to do to make sure that people will choose us next time rather than choose the other mob? And that means, in many cases, that our governments become cautious, risk averse, and they don't ever want to make any big or bold decisions. And so that means things that need to be talked about and the things that need to be thought about, such as the future of the nation beyond the next 3 or 4 years, often doesn't get thought about because no government wants to spook the voters. No government wants to face the fact that, well, if you do that, or if you say that's what you're going to do, we're not going to vote for you next time.